The warm breeze of the Gulf Coast of Florida felt like a physical weight lifting off my tired shoulders. I sat on my sunlit balcony, a cup of strong black coffee in my hand, watching the turquoise waves lap gently against the white sand. It was a beautiful evening, but more importantly, it was exactly 5 o'clock on Christmas Eve. I set my coffee down on the glass table next to my phone. I didn't have to wait long. Right as the digital clock shifted to 5:01, the screen lit up. The phone began to vibrate violently, buzzing against the glass like an angry hornet. First, it was a text from my son, Trevor. The card declined. "They are kicking us out. Call me right now." Then came a message from my daughter, Danielle. "Dad, answer the phone. Garrett's card is frozen. What did you do?" A second later, my daughter-in-law, Kelsey, chimed in. "The lodge manager is threatening to call the police. We have nowhere to go." My phone screen was a cascading waterfall of pure, unadulterated panic. I simply sat back, crossed my legs, and watched the notifications roll in. I didn't answer. I didn't even flinch. For the last 10 years, ever since my late wife Marianne passed away, my family told me every single winter that I somehow ruined Christmas. I was too cheap, too traditional, too boring. I ruined their holidays by asking them to budget. I ruined their holidays by not buying the right vintage of champagne. So this year, I gave them exactly what they wanted. I didn't show up to ruin anything, and I didn't pay for any of it either. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who took your generosity for granted, to understand how my children ended up stranded in the freezing cold on Christmas Eve. You have to understand the illusion we had been living in. That illusion completely shattered exactly 1 month prior, on Thanksgiving. I was hosting the holiday at my house, a modest 4-bedroom colonial I had lived in for 30 years. I had paid for everything. I hired a private catering company to cook a massive, beautiful feast because my daughter Danielle refused to eat my home cooking, claiming she was on a strict organic diet that I simply could not comprehend. I had spent nearly $1,000 just to make sure the table was perfectly set, with her favorite free-range turkey and imported sides. But the moment Danielle and Kelsey walked through the front door, the complaints began. Danielle tossed her expensive coat onto my sofa and immediately sighed at the temperature in the room, lowering the thermostat without asking. Kelsey, holding a glass of wine I had poured for her, took one sip and wrinkled her nose. "This wine is so aggressive, Warren," she said, setting the crystal glass down on the counter with a loud clink. "Did you get this on sale at the grocery store?" I had actually spent $60 on that bottle, but I swallowed my pride and offered her a different one. As we sat down to eat, the atmosphere was suffocating. I sat at the head of the table, listening to my children and their spouses talk right over me. Garrett, Danielle's husband, spent 20 minutes bragging about his new luxury SUV, the very same SUV I was secretly co-signing the massive payments for, because his credit was completely destroyed. Trevor spent the dinner talking about his new tech startup, boasting about being a CEO, conveniently leaving out the fact that I had been floating his company with monthly bridge loans just to keep the lights on. They looked around my house with barely concealed disdain. "Dad, when are you going to update these drapes?" Danielle asked, pointing a manicured finger at the living room window. "It smells like a museum in here. You really should think about modernizing or downsizing." I just nodded and chewed my food, keeping the peace, just like Marianne used to do. I had spent my entire life building a massive logistics firm from a single delivery truck. I sold it for millions a decade ago, but I kept my wealth quiet. I lived modestly, because I wanted my kids to learn the value of $1. Instead, my silence only bred their entitlement. When the plates were finally cleared, Trevor stood up and clapped his hands together. "All right, family," he announced with a wide, arrogant smile. "Let us talk about Christmas. I found the perfect spot this year. We are doing a luxury ski lodge in Telluride. It has a private hot tub, ski-in and ski-out access, and a private chef option." I looked at him, surprised. "Telluride?" I asked mildly. "Trevor, that sounds incredibly expensive. How much is a lodge like that going to cost for a week?" Trevor waved his hand dismissively. "It is about $25,000 for the week. But do not worry about the details. Dad, it is a family tradition. You will cover the deposit to secure the booking, right? We can put the incidentals on your black card, like we did last year in Jackson Hole." I felt a familiar knot tightening in my stomach. "$25,000 for a single week," I said gently, trying to reason with him. "That is a lot of money to drop on a cabin. Your startup is barely breaking even right now. Maybe we should look into something a little more reasonable. We could rent a nice place up in the local mountains for a fraction of that cost." Danielle slammed her hands down on the table, rolling her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. "Unbelievable," she groaned. "You do this every single year, Dad. You always ruin the holidays with your penny pinching. We just want one nice, memorable family vacation, and you have to make it a lecture about budgeting. You have the money sitting in the bank doing absolutely nothing. Why do you insist on stifling our happiness?" Garrett chimed in, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. "Come on, Warren. You cannot take it with you. Do not be the Grinch. Just stroke the check so we can have a good time." I looked around the table. 4 healthy, capable adults in their late 30s and early 40s, glaring at me like I was a stubborn child, refusing to hand over a toy. I felt exhausted. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that had nothing to do with my age and everything to do with the monsters I had inadvertently raised. I raised my hands in surrender, forcing a weak smile. "All right," I murmured. "We will talk about Telluride. Let me look at the numbers next week." They immediately cheered, raising their glasses to toast to themselves, completely ignoring me for the rest of the evening. About an hour later, the house had quieted down. The kids were in the living room watching football, leaving me to clean up the catering trays in the kitchen by myself. Trevor had left his expensive leather jacket draped over one of the kitchen bar stools. Suddenly, a muffled ringing started coming from inside his coat pocket. I dried my hands on a dish towel and reached into the pocket, intending to pull the phone out and bring it to him in the living room. I pulled the phone out. It stopped ringing, but the screen was brightly lit. Trevor did not use a screen lock, and the phone was opened directly to a group text message chat. The name of the group chat caught my eye immediately. It was titled, "Ski Trip Operation Deed." I froze. My thumb hovered over the screen. I knew I should not read my son's private messages, but the title sent a cold shiver down my spine. I looked closer, reading the glowing text messages exchanged between my children and their spouses. The first message was from Garrett. "Just stroke his ego for a few more days until he signs the payment for the cabin rental. Let him think he is the big man in charge. After the holidays, we push the assisted living brochure again. He is getting too old for that big house anyway." My breath caught in my throat. Assisted living. I was 71 years old, ran 3 miles every morning, and managed my own investment portfolio. I was in perfect health. Then I read the reply from Trevor's wife, Kelsey. If we can get him to put the house in a trust for us now, to save on taxes, before the end of the year, we will not have to deal with his penny pinching next year. We can sell this museum and use the cash to pay off Trevor's business loans. Finally, a text from my own daughter, Danielle. Agreed. Let him pay for Telluride first. Once we get the deed signed over, we take control of the accounts. I am so sick of begging him for our own money. The screen timed out and went black, leaving me staring at my own reflection in the dark glass. The illusion of my family shattered into a million irreparable pieces in that quiet kitchen. They did not love me. They did not even respect me. I was not a father to them anymore. I was simply a dying ATM machine that they were actively plotting to dismantle. They were planning to steal my home, lock me away in a facility, and drain the wealth I had spent a lifetime building. I did not scream. I did not march into the living room and throw them out of my house. A strange, icy calm washed over me. I quietly slipped the phone back into Trevor's coat pocket, exactly where I had found it. I smoothed out the leather, turned around, and went back to washing the dishes. I knew right then and there that getting angry would only give them the upper hand. If they wanted to play a game of strategy, they had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the one who built the empire they were trying to steal, and I knew exactly how to tear it down. The morning after Thanksgiving did not bring the usual smell of leftover turkey or the comforting quiet of an empty house. It brought a cold and sharp clarity. I woke up at 5 in the morning, long before the sun even thought about rising, and brewed a pot of the cheapest coffee I had in the pantry. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at the exact spot where I had found Trevor's coat the night before. I did not feel angry. Anger is a hot and loud emotion. What I felt was absolute freezing precision. I showered, shaved, and put on my best tailored suit. It was a suit my children had never seen me wear. To them, I was just the guy in faded flannel shirts and denim who complained about the price of gas. They did not know that the suit I wore cost more than their mortgage payments. I drove my 10-year-old pickup truck into the heart of the city financial district. The valet outside the towering glass skyscraper gave my truck a funny look, but the moment I handed him a crisp $100 bill, his attitude changed entirely. That was the magic trick my children loved so much: money. It changed how people looked at you, and it changed how people treated you. But I had spent my life trying to prove that character mattered more than cash. I walked into the marble lobby of the building and rode the private elevator up to the penthouse suite. The brass letters on the wall read, "Whitlock and Associates Wealth Management." Mr. Whitlock was waiting for me in his corner office, overlooking the sprawling skyline. He was 55 years old, sharp as a tack, and one of the very few people on this earth who knew exactly how much I was worth. He stood up immediately and extended his hand. "Warren," he said, his voice laced with genuine surprise. "You usually only come up here once a year for tax season. What brings you in on a Friday morning?" I sat down in the heavy leather chair across from his mahogany desk. "I need to sever my financial ties," I said quietly. "All of them." Mr. Whitlock sat back down and slowly steepled his fingers. He looked at me closely, reading the exhaustion in my eyes. He knew my history better than my own blood did. He knew that 40 years ago, I started out with one broken-down delivery truck. I worked 18-hour days, sleeping in the cab of that truck, eating cold canned soup, driving cross-country to deliver freight. Over the decades, that single truck turned into a fleet. That fleet turned into a national logistics empire. When I finally sold the company 10 years ago, right before my sweet Marianne got sick, the buyout was astronomical. We had more money than generations of our family could ever spend. But Marianne and I made a choice early on. We decided to keep the wealth incredibly quiet. We stayed in our modest suburban home. We drove average cars. We shopped at regular grocery stores and clipped coupons. We wanted Trevor and Danielle to grow up normal. We wanted them to understand the value of hard work, to know what it meant to earn $1, and to build something with their own 2 hands. We thought hiding the trust funds and the massive investment portfolios would protect them from becoming entitled. We thought we were doing the right thing. I looked out the massive window at the city below, feeling a profound sense of failure washing over me. "We were wrong, Mr. Whitlock," I said, my voice thick with heavy regret. "By hiding the wealth, but secretly bailing them out every time they failed, I did not teach them resilience. I taught them that consequences do not exist. I became an invisible safety net, and now that net has turned into a hammock for them to sleep in, while they plot to steal the rest of my livelihood." Mr. Whitlock opened his laptop, his expression turning purely professional. "Talk to me, Warren. What happened?" I told him everything. I told him about the Thanksgiving dinner, the complaints about the wine, the demands to pay $25,000 for a luxury cabin in Telluride, and then I told him about the group chat, Operation Deed. I repeated the words my children and their spouses had typed. How they planned to stroke my ego just long enough to get me to pay for their vacation. How they schemed to trick me into signing my house over to them to save on taxes. How they planned to shove me into an assisted living facility and take control of my accounts because they were tired of begging me for money. Mr. Whitlock stopped typing. He closed his laptop halfway and looked at me, his face pale with a mixture of shock and professional fury. "Warren," he said slowly, "that is not just ungrateful. That is elder abuse. That is a coordinated conspiracy to defraud you of your assets. We can involve the authorities right now. We can file restraining orders and freeze their access to you." "No," I replied firmly. "No police, no dramatic courtroom scenes. That is what they would expect from a scared old man. I am not a scared old man. I am the man who built the empire they are trying to steal, and I am going to tear down their entire reality brick by brick. Pull up the ledgers, Mr. Whitlock. I want to see exactly how much I have been bleeding." He opened his laptop fully and brought up my private accounts. The numbers on the screen were staggering even to me. Over the past 3 years alone, I had secretly funneled $140,000 into Trevor's failing tech startup. I had disguised them as anonymous bridge loans through a shell corporation Mr. Whitlock managed, just so Trevor could feel like a successful chief executive. He thought he was attracting venture capital. In reality, his own father was artificially keeping his business afloat because his ideas were completely unprofitable. Then we looked at Danielle and Garrett. 2 years ago, they bought a sprawling luxury home that they absolutely could not afford. The only reason the bank approved their massive mortgage was because I secretly co-signed it and pledged a large portion of my investment portfolio as collateral. Every single month, a silent transfer from my accounts covered the deficit in their mortgage payments. They drove luxury vehicles and hosted lavish parties, entirely funded by the ghost money I pumped into their lives just to keep the peace. "They think they are independently wealthy," I said, staring at the glowing screen. "They truly believe their lifestyle is a direct result of their own success. They think I am just a stingy old man sitting on a small retirement fund that they are naturally entitled to." Mr. Whitlock nodded slowly. Because you never let them feel the burn of failure, Warren. You insulated them so perfectly that they mistook your invisible support for their own brilliance. What do you want to do? I want to cut the strings, I said, but I want to do it my way. I want you to initiate the paperwork to remove my name as the guarantor on Danielle and Garrett's mortgage. I want you to completely halt the automated bridge loans feeding into Trevor's business accounts. Withdraw all corporate backing immediately. Mr. Whitlock began typing furiously on his keyboard. Consider it done. The mortgage company will immediately flag Danielle's account for insufficient collateral. They will freeze her lines of credit and demand a massive balloon payment to balance the loan-to-value ratio. As for Trevor, without your monthly capital injection, his startup accounts will hit absolute zero before the end of the month. His creditors will auto-draft whatever is left. They will be financially ruined in a matter of weeks. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the mahogany desk. I do not want this to happen in a few weeks, Mr. Whitlock. I want this to happen on my schedule. Can you time the withdrawals? Can you instruct the banks and the corporate entities to execute these freezes and account drains on a specific date? Mr. Whitlock raised an eyebrow. Yes, we can put future-dated holds and execution orders on the transfers. When do you want the hammer to fall? I smiled, but I knew my eyes were completely cold. They want me to pay for a luxury lodge in Telluride for Christmas. The final payment for that lodge is due on December 24th. I want every single financial lifeline I provide to evaporate on Christmas Eve. Exactly at 5 in the afternoon. Mr. Whitlock looked at me for a long moment. He saw the heartbreak of a father who had tried his best, replaced by the ruthless calculation of a businessman protecting his life's work. He nodded respectfully. I will prepare the execution orders, Warren. Everything will detonate at exactly 5 o'clock on December 24th. What will you do until then? I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket. I am going to go home, pretend I saw nothing, and act like the naive and burdensome old man they think I am. I will give them my credit cards to book their flights and their luxury rentals. I will let them climb as high as they possibly can, because the higher they climb on my dime, the harder the fall is going to be when the money disappears. The heavy silence in the office was only broken by the sharp, methodical clicking of Mr. Whitlock typing on his keyboard. He did not speak right away. He just pulled up the highly secured files, his eyes darting across the glowing screen as he compiled the true scope of my financial bleeding. I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, looking out at the sweeping views of the city skyline. Down there, millions of people were working hard, struggling to pay their rent, sacrificing for their families. And up here, in this quiet penthouse, I was about to look at the exact price tag of my own children's betrayal. Mr. Whitlock turned the monitor slightly so I could see the screen. The raw data was laid out in stark, dark black and white columns. It was no longer just a feeling or a suspicion. It was math, and math does not lie. Let us start with your son, Mr. Whitlock said quietly, bringing up the first spreadsheet. I stared at the rows of transactions. Over the past 3 years, the shell corporation we had set up to act as an anonymous angel investor had been pumping a steady, relentless stream of cash into Trevor's tech startup. I watched the numbers tally up at the bottom of the screen. $140,000. It was a staggering amount of money to throw into a black hole. Trevor loved to play the role of the visionary chief executive. He walked around the city in tailored suits, hosting expensive networking lunches, and bragging about how his company was disrupting the industry. He loved to tell me how hard it was to be a self-made man. The reality staring back at me from the screen was pathetic. His company generated absolutely zero profit. The only reason his business checking account had not been shut down by the bank was because my anonymous corporate entity automatically deposited $5,000 every single month, sometimes more, when he needed to cover payroll for his useless consultants. Every time Trevor took his wife Kelsey on a weekend getaway to the Turks and Caicos to celebrate a supposed business milestone, he was celebrating with my money. I was funding his delusion. I had essentially bought him a $140,000 participation trophy just so he would not have to feel the sting of failure. Mr. Whitlock scrolled down, highlighting a specific cluster of transfers from just 2 months ago. "Do you remember this one, Warren?" he asked softly. I looked at the date. It was a transfer for $12,000. My stomach turned to ice. That was the exact week Trevor told the family he had finally secured a major round of Series A funding. He threw a lavish dinner party at a downtown steakhouse to celebrate his genius. He even gave a toast, looking me right in the eye, saying that the traditional business models of my generation were dead and that his modern approach was the future. I paid for that dinner indirectly, and I funded the very success he was using to mock my life's work. I nodded slowly, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. "Close that file," I said. "Show me the rest." Mr. Whitlock clicked out of Trevor's ledger and opened a much thicker and more complicated file. This was the portfolio, holding the guarantees for Danielle and Garrett. When my daughter and her husband decided they needed to upgrade their lifestyle to a massive luxury estate in a gated community, they came to me crying about unfair interest rates and predatory lenders. They claimed they had the income, but just needed a little help with the underwriting. Because I loved my daughter, and because I wanted my grandchildren to have a beautiful backyard, I agreed to be a silent guarantor on their jumbo mortgage. I knew it was a risk, but the data Mr. Whitlock was showing me now revealed a complete and total financial disaster. Garrett liked to project the image of a highly successful financial consultant. He drove an imported luxury sport utility vehicle that cost more than my first 3 houses combined. He wore custom watches and talked down to waiters. But looking at the raw numbers, Garrett was drowning. His actual income barely covered the property taxes and the utility bills on their sprawling estate. To prevent the bank from foreclosing on their luxury dream home, Mr. Whitlock had set up an automated deficit coverage protocol. Every single month, when Danielle and Garrett inevitably fell short on their massive mortgage payment, my private investment portfolio quietly liquidated assets to cover the difference. I was bleeding $4,000 every 30 days just to keep a roof over their heads. The hypocrisy of it all tasted like battery acid in my mouth. I thought back to Thanksgiving, just a few weeks ago. I remembered Danielle standing in my living room, the very home I had owned free and clear for 30 years. I remembered her looking at my drapes and my furniture with absolute disgust, telling me my house smelled like a museum and that I needed to modernize. She stood there, dripping in entitlement, judging the home of the man who was literally paying for the marble floors she walked on every single day. She thought she was a self-sufficient upper-class woman. In reality, she was entirely dependent on the charity of the father she was actively conspiring to lock away in a nursing home. "They are not just living beyond their means," Mr. Whitlock said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "They are living in a financial fantasy world that you have entirely subsidized. If we remove your portfolio as the collateral backbone for that mortgage, the bank will immediately run an audit on Garrett's debt-to-income ratio. When they see he cannot support the loan on his own, They will freeze his revolving credit lines and issue a demand for immediate payment. The house of cards will collapse instantly. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and closed my eyes. The silence of the penthouse pressed in on me. For a long time, I had blamed myself. I thought that by working so hard, building my logistics empire, I had neglected to teach them character. When my beautiful Marianne passed away, the grief had hollowed me out. I did not want to fight with my children. I did not want to see them struggle while I sat on a mountain of wealth. I thought my money could buy peace. I thought it could buy family harmony. But looking at the cold, hard numbers, I realized I had not bought peace. I had financed monsters. I had fed their arrogance until it grew so large it consumed their basic human decency. They did not look at me and see a grieving widower or a loving father. They looked at me and saw a host organism. And like any parasite, they were now planning to kill the host because they were tired of waiting for the natural end. I opened my eyes and looked at the wealth management attorney. The sorrow I had felt earlier that morning was completely gone. The hesitation was gone. There was no more guilt left in my heart. The raw data had set me free. They wanted to play games with property deeds and assisted living facilities. They wanted to treat my life's work as their personal slush fund. They were about to learn a very harsh lesson about where that money actually came from, and more importantly, who controlled the valve. "Leave the data on the screen," I told Mr. Whitlock, my voice steady and resolved. "I want to memorize these numbers. I want to remember exactly how much my illusions cost me. Because starting right now, I am not paying another dime for their arrogance." Mr. Whitlock nodded, a grim understanding passing between us. The audit was complete. The full extent of the bleeding was exposed. Now it was time to close the wounds and prepare the trap. Let them buy their expensive ski gear. Let them book their luxury flights. Let them walk right to the edge of the cliff, completely unaware that I was about to remove the ground from beneath their feet. I sat across from the heavy mahogany desk and looked at the man who had managed my wealth for over a decade. Mr. Whitlock waited in perfect silence for my final instructions. I told him I wanted every single tie severed. I wanted the corporate bridge loans stopped. I wanted my name removed as the guarantor for the mortgage. I wanted the credit lines frozen, but I told him I did not want it done today. I wanted a timed detonation. I instructed him to schedule the execution of these orders for a very specific moment, December 24th, at exactly 5 in the afternoon. That was the exact moment my family expected me to be their silent wallet in the middle of a luxury ski lodge. Mr. Whitlock nodded slowly and began typing the final commands into his secured system. We spent the next hour reviewing the legal firewalls I would need. He ensured that my personal assets would be completely shielded from their incoming bankruptcy. He established irrevocable trusts that they could never touch or contest. I wanted to make absolutely certain that when the dust settled, they could not drag me into court. When we finished reviewing the documents, I stood up and shook his hand. It felt like shaking hands with a surgeon who had just successfully removed a malignant tumor from my body. The disease was gone. I was finally cured of my own enabling behavior. I left the penthouse office and took the elevator down to the marble lobby. I walked out into the crisp afternoon air. The valet brought my old truck around and I climbed inside. I gripped the worn steering wheel and took a deep breath. For the first time in 10 years, I felt a strange sense of lightness. I was no longer an old man, waiting for his ungrateful children to visit. I was a man in total control of his destiny. The drive back to the suburbs was quiet. I watched the neighborhoods transition from towering city buildings to sprawling luxury estates, and finally, to my quiet tree-lined street. I parked in my driveway and sat in the truck for a few long minutes. I needed to compose myself. I had to become the greatest actor in the world. I had to walk into my house and pretend I was exactly the foolish old man they wrote about in their group chat. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled like expensive pine candles. Danielle and Kelsey were sitting on my living room sofa. They were already looking at ski resort brochures on a tablet. Trevor and Garrett were in the kitchen drinking my imported beer. They all stopped talking when I walked in. I put on a wide smile. I made my eyes look soft and eager to please. I told them I had been thinking about our conversation from Thanksgiving. I told them I realized I had been too rigid and that life was too short to worry about budgets. The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous and sickening. Danielle jumped up from the sofa and hugged me. It was a cold and hollow hug, but I hugged her back anyway. Trevor walked out of the kitchen with a huge grin on his face. He patted me on the back and called me the best dad in the world. Garrett smirked and raised his beer bottle in a silent toast. Kelsey immediately started talking about the private chefs we could hire in Telluride. It was amazing how quickly their disdain turned into affection the moment I agreed to fund their luxurious desires. I walked over to the hallway table and picked up my leather wallet. I pulled out my 2 black corporate credit cards. These were the cards tied directly to the accounts Mr. Whitlock was going to obliterate on Christmas Eve. I handed one card to Trevor and the other card to Danielle. I told them to go ahead and book the luxury lodge. I told them to reserve the first-class flights. I even suggested they rent the most expensive sport utility vehicles they could find for the snowy mountain roads. I told them I wanted this Christmas to be the most memorable family vacation we had ever taken. I told them I wanted them to have everything they desired. Danielle looked at the heavy metal card in her hand, as if she had just won the lottery. Trevor laughed and said he would handle all the reservations immediately. They did not know that Mr. Whitlock had already placed a strict temporary limit on those specific cards. They would have just enough clearance to book the reservations and pay the initial deposits. But the final authorizations, the massive pending charges that hotels and rental agencies process upon check-in, would fall exactly on the date the accounts were scheduled to vanish. I sat down in my armchair and watched them plan my supposed financial ruin. They were so excited. They pointed at the tablet screen, choosing expensive excursions and luxury spa packages. They did not ask me what I wanted to do in Telluride. They did not ask if I wanted to go snowshoeing or if I preferred a certain type of dinner. I was completely invisible to them again. But this time, it did not hurt. It only confirmed that I was making the right decision. Every time Danielle added a $2,000 charge to the card, she was digging her own grave. Every time Garrett suggested a premium upgrade, he was ensuring his own eviction. I watched them celebrate their victory over me. They truly believed they had manipulated an old man into funding their extravagant lifestyle. They believed they were smart and sophisticated. They believed their group chat was a brilliant tactical maneuver. They had no idea they were simply rats running blindly into a trap I had designed just for them. Their greed was blinding them to the reality of the situation. They thought they were draining my accounts, but they were actually tightening the noose around their own necks. I excused myself and walked to my bedroom. I closed the door and sat on the edge of my bed. I looked at a framed photograph of my late wife, Marianne, on the nightstand. I traced the edge of the silver frame with my finger. I told her silently that I was sorry it had come to this. I told her I was sorry our dream of a perfect family had turned into a nightmare of greed and entitlement. But I also told her that I was finally fixing the mistake we had made. I was going to teach our children the value of $1. It was just going to be the most painful and expensive lesson they would ever learn. The timers were set. The trap was baited. The credit cards in their hands were nothing more than ticking time bombs. Every swipe they made gave them a false sense of security. Every confirmation email they received pushed them closer to the edge of the cliff. All I had to do now was play the part of the compliant father for a few more weeks. All I had to do was wait for the clock to run out. It was exactly 2 weeks before the Telluride trip was scheduled to begin. The house was quiet and still. I had spent the morning arranging a few modest holiday decorations in the living room, just to keep up the appearance of a festive and oblivious old man. The winter snow had started to fall outside, dusting the driveway in a thin layer of white. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, reading the morning paper, when I heard the heavy engine of a vehicle pulling up to the curb. I looked out the frost-covered window and saw Garrett park his massive imported sport utility vehicle right on the edge of my front lawn. Trevor stepped out of the passenger side, looking tense. But they were not alone. A third man climbed out of the back seat of the vehicle. He was wearing a cheap gray suit that did not fit him quite right, and he carried a battered leather briefcase. He looked completely out of place in my quiet suburban neighborhood. I knew instantly that this was not a friendly holiday visit to check on their father. This was a calculated and aggressive strike. They were moving on to the next phase of their plan. I did not get up from my chair. I waited for them to let themselves into my home. Trevor turned his key in the lock and pushed the front door open, leading the procession into my living room. They did not bother to take off their snowy shoes. They simply marched in, tracking wet footprints across the hardwood floor I had meticulously maintained for 3 decades. Garrett wore a tight smile that was meant to look reassuring, but it only made him look like a predator cornering its prey. Trevor rubbed his hands together loudly, talking about how cold it was outside. He introduced the stranger in the cheap suit as a brilliant tax consultant and estate specialist they had hired to help the family optimize our financial future. The man smelled of stale coffee and cheap cologne. He gave me a slick, practiced smile and handed me a business card that felt flimsy in my fingers. He did not look like a man who managed wealth or handled complex tax law. He looked like a man who specialized in making legal problems disappear for a flat cash fee. I looked at the card and then looked up at my son. I kept my face entirely blank, playing the role of the confused elderly father who was simply happy to have company on a cold morning. Garrett took control of the conversation immediately. He sat down heavily on my sofa, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees to manufacture a false sense of urgency and intimacy. He lowered his voice as if he were letting me in on a highly classified secret. He started talking fast, throwing around complicated financial terms like capital gains liabilities and probate penalties and end-of-year tax shelters. He told me that the government was preparing to change the estate tax laws on January 1st. He painted a terrifying picture of bureaucratic overreach, claiming that if I passed away suddenly, the state would seize nearly half the value of my home before Trevor and Danielle could even access it. Trevor chimed in right on cue, playing the role of the concerned and protective son. He told me they had spent weeks consulting with this specialist to find a way to protect my legacy. He said they had found a completely legal and highly effective tax loophole, but it required immediate action. The window was closing rapidly, and they needed to execute the strategy before we all left for the luxury ski lodge in Telluride. I sat there listening to their rehearsed performance. It was a perfectly choreographed routine, designed to confuse and panic a vulnerable old man into making a hasty, irreversible decision. They wanted me to believe they were saving me from a financial disaster. I knew they were just trying to orchestrate one. The man in the gray suit unlatched his briefcase with a loud click. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, printed on heavy bond paper. He slid them across my coffee table, stopping right in front of me. He handed me a heavy brass pen. He pointed to a series of yellow sticky notes marking the signature lines on the bottom of every page. He explained that this was a simple quitclaim deed combined with an irrevocable trust transfer. He used a lot of soothing words, promising that nothing would actually change in my day-to-day life. He assured me I could live in the house for the rest of my natural life, and that this was just a protective measure against the greedy government. But he smoothly glossed over the fact that signing those papers would immediately strip me of all legal ownership of the property. The trust he was describing would be controlled entirely by Trevor and Danielle as the sole acting trustees. If I put my signature on that dotted line, they would have the absolute legal authority to sell my house out from under me the very next day. They could liquidate the property, cash out the equity, and force me into whatever miserable assisted living facility they deemed affordable. The memory of their group chat flashed vividly in my mind. Operation Deed. This was the exact moment they had been planning since Thanksgiving. Garrett leaned in closer, staring at the pen in my hand. He told me that doing this now would save us all a massive headache next year. He said I had worked too hard to let the taxman take my house. Trevor nodded eagerly, tapping his foot against the floor with barely contained nervous energy. He told me to just sign the papers so we could put all this boring legal stuff behind us and focus on having an amazing family Christmas in the mountains. They were crowding me physically, imposing themselves in my space to create a high-pressure environment. The lawyer stood over me, pointing at the first yellow sticky note, tapping the paper with his finger. I looked down at the brass pen resting in my palm. I felt the cool weight of the metal. I thought about the sheer audacity of my son and son-in-law standing in my living room, trying to rob me blind while pretending they were doing me a favor. I thought about the thousands of hours I had spent working to pay off this house, to provide a safe haven for my family. And now they were bringing a shady operative into my sanctuary to swindle me out of my life savings. The entitlement was suffocating. They thought I was foolish enough to sign away my independence just because they used a few intimidating legal words and faked a sense of panic. They truly believed they were the smartest men in the room. I let the silence stretch out in the living room. I stared at the dense paragraphs of legal jargon designed to obscure the simple truth of the theft. I could hear the antique grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, measuring the long seconds as they waited for my compliance. Trevor shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly anxious for me to put the ink on the paper. Garrett let out a small, forced sigh of impatience, as if dealing with my hesitation was a massive burden on his busy schedule. The lawyer offered a patronizing smile, telling me that these legal documents always look intimidating, but they were completely standard procedure for a man in my financial bracket. They had no idea that I had already sat in a penthouse office with a real attorney and reviewed the exact mechanisms they were trying to exploit. They did not realize that I had already built an impenetrable fortress around my true wealth. This house was just a fraction of what I owned, but to them, it was a massive payday. I looked up from the documents and met Trevor right in his eyes. I saw the desperate greed hiding just beneath his fake smile. I saw the hollow entitlement that had replaced the boy I had tried to raise. It took every ounce of my willpower not to snap the brass pen in half and throw them all out into the freezing snow. But I knew that reacting with anger would ruin the trap I had so carefully set. I had to swallow my pride and play the role they had written for me. I had to let them think they were winning the war. I held the heavy brass pen suspended inches above the thick stack of legal documents. My hand hovered over the yellow sticky note that demanded my signature. I could feel the eager, suffocating energy radiating from Trevor and Garrett. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, holding their breath as they waited for me to sign away my independence. The shady tax consultant stood entirely too close, his cheap cologne mingling unpleasantly with the scent of the pine candles Danielle had insisted I buy. I looked at the sharp nib of the pen, and then I looked up at my son. I let my shoulders slump forward just a fraction of an inch. I allowed the natural weariness of a man my age to settle into my posture, exhaling a long, ragged breath that sounded like it came from deep within frail lungs. I needed them to believe I was exactly who they thought I was. A tired, confused, sentimental old man who was easily overwhelmed by big words and aggressive tactics. So I began the performance of my life. I let the tip of the brass pen tap gently against the paper, and then I forced a slight rhythmic tremor into my right hand. It was subtle at first, just a nervous quiver, but as I lowered my hand closer to the signature line, I made the shaking more pronounced. I watched Trevor's eyes dart down to my trembling fingers. I saw a flash of pity cross his face, instantly swallowed by his overwhelming greed. I let the pen slip from my grip. It clattered loudly against the glass coffee table, rolling away from the documents. I let out a soft, nervous chuckle, pulling my hand back and rubbing my wrist as if it ached terribly. "I am sorry, boys," I murmured, letting my voice waver just enough to sound fragile. "My arthritis has been acting up with the cold weather, and looking at all these legal clauses, well, it is just making my head spin a little bit. It is a lot of paperwork to process on a Tuesday morning." Garrett immediately stepped forward, reaching for the pen to hand it back to me. "Warren, it is really, really simple," he said, adopting the patronizing tone one might use to explain a math problem to a toddler. "You do not need to understand all the legal jargon. That is what we pay the specialist for. All you need to do is sign on the yellow tabs, and your estate is protected from the government. It takes 5 seconds, and then you never have to worry about it again." I shook my head slowly, looking at the documents with wide, bewildered eyes. "I know, Garrett. I know you are looking out for me," I said, layering my voice with deep manufactured gratitude. "But this is my home. This is where I lived with Marianne. This is where we raised Trevor and Danielle. Signing it away, even into a trust, it just feels so permanent. It is making me feel incredibly anxious, and my doctor told me I need to keep my blood pressure down during the holidays." Trevor exchanged a frustrated glance with his brother-in-law. The shady lawyer cleared his throat, leaning in to apply more pressure. "Sir, with all due respect to your sentimental attachments, the tax codes do not care about your memories. If we do not execute this transfer before the fiscal year closes, you are exposing your children to massive liabilities." I shrank back into the cushions of my armchair, acting physically intimidated by the lawyer's aggressive posture. I looked at Trevor, letting my eyes water just a fraction, projecting the image of a father pleading for patience from his strong, capable son. "Trevor," I whispered, clutching the armrests of my chair. "Please, I just want this Christmas to be perfect." I let the silence hang in the room for a beat before delivering the hook. "You know, I have been looking forward to this Telluride trip since Thanksgiving. I gave you the corporate cards because I want us to celebrate as a family. I want to see the snow. I want to sit by the fire with all of you. And I want to just enjoy being together without worrying about taxes and deeds and government penalties. If I sign this right now, I am going to spend the whole vacation worrying that I made a mistake. My mind will not be at peace. I paused, letting the tremor in my hand return as I reached up to adjust my glasses. Let us just wait, I pleaded softly. Let us go to Telluride. Let us have the most beautiful, expensive, perfect Christmas we have ever had. I promise you the very first week of January, when we are all back home and relaxed, we can sit down with this nice gentleman, and I will sign whatever you need me to sign. I just do not want a dark cloud over my holiday. Please, son, do this for your old man. The room fell completely silent. I could practically see the gears turning in Trevor and Garrett's heads. They were weighing the risks. On one hand, they desperately wanted the deed to my house secured before the year ended. On the other hand, I was dangling the ultimate prize right in front of their faces. An all expenses paid, unlimited budget luxury vacation to Telluride. I was offering them the very black cards that would fund their extravagant fantasies, and all they had to do was grant me a 2-week delay on the paperwork. Garrett looked at Trevor, giving him a barely perceptible nod. Garrett was calculating the odds. He knew that if they pushed me too hard right now, I might get spooked. I might call my own lawyer, Mr. Whitlock, to review the documents, which would instantly destroy their entire scheme. They had to keep me isolated, happy, and compliant. A confused, sentimental old man promising to sign the papers in January was much easier to manage than a defensive, suspicious old man demanding a second legal opinion today. Trevor sighed, running a hand through his hair in a theatrical display of patience. He looked down at me with a soft, condescending smile. "Okay, Dad," he said smoothly. "Okay. We do not want to stress you out. If waiting until after Telluride makes you feel better, then we will wait. The most important thing is that you enjoy the trip." He turned to the lawyer in the cheap suit and nodded toward the door. "Pack it up," Trevor ordered. "We will reconvene in the first week of January." The lawyer looked annoyed, clearly unhappy about having to wait for his payout. But he began gathering the documents and shoving them back into his battered briefcase. Garrett clapped his hands together, his smug demeanor instantly returning. "It is settled then," Garrett declared cheerfully. "We are going to have the time of our lives, Warren. You will not regret this." I smiled up at them, looking incredibly relieved. "Thank you, boys," I breathed out, letting my shoulders relax. "You have no idea how much this means to me. Now go on and finish booking everything. Do not spare any expense. I want the absolute best for my family." Trevor and Garrett practically beamed with greed. They said their goodbyes, playing the roles of the perfect caring sons, and led the shady lawyer out of my house. I listened to the heavy front door click shut. I listened to their footsteps crunching through the snow on the walkway. I listened to the engine of Garrett's luxury vehicle roar to life and fade away down the street. I sat alone in my quiet living room for a long time. The manufactured tremor in my right hand vanished instantly. My posture straightened. The frail, confused old man they had just spoken to ceased to exist the moment they left the property. I stood up from my armchair, my mind sharp and clear. They had taken the bait perfectly. They traded the immediate theft of my home for the promise of a lavish vacation, completely oblivious to the fact that the black cards in their wallets were tied to a ticking clock. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they were being merciful by granting me a delay. They had no idea they had just sealed their own spectacular downfall. The notifications began arriving the very next morning. They did not come all at once, but rather in a steady, predictable rhythm that made my phone vibrate softly against the kitchen counter. I sat on my usual stool with a fresh cup of coffee and simply watched the screen light up. Each notification was an automated alert from the bank, detailing a new pending charge on the corporate cards I had handed over. Trevor and Garrett had wasted absolutely no time, believing they had successfully cornered me into surrendering my entire estate. They felt completely unburdened by consequence. In their minds, my house was already theirs. My savings were already theirs. I was nothing more than a temporary custodian of their wealth, and they were finally giving themselves permission to spend it. The first alert was from an exclusive airline concierge service. Trevor had upgraded all 4 of their tickets to first class. He could never tolerate flying in the main cabin, especially not when he was trying to project the image of a highly successful tech entrepreneur. The charge was staggering. It was enough money to feed a normal family for an entire year, but to Trevor, it was just a drop in the bucket of his early inheritance. I watched the number flash on my screen, and I took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not feel the usual knot of anxiety or frustration that used to plague me when I saw his reckless spending. Instead, I felt a deep, profound calm. I knew that every single dollar he charged was a phantom. The bank was authorizing the holds based on my massive credit limit, but the actual settlement of those funds was scheduled to hit exactly when the accounts would be permanently frozen. Trevor was not buying luxury flights. He was buying a front-row ticket to his own financial execution. A few hours later, the alerts shifted from travel expenses to high-end retail. Danielle and Kelsey had clearly decided that their upcoming mountain vacation required an entirely new wardrobe. The notifications rolled in from the most expensive boutiques in the city. There were charges for thousands of dollars at designer winter apparel stores. I could picture them walking through the pristine showrooms, laughing and pointing at fur-lined parkas and custom-fitted snow boots. They were not buying gear to stay warm. They were buying uniforms to prove their status to complete strangers on a ski slope. I watched a single charge for $4,000, clear from a boutique known for imported cashmere. Kelsey always complained that she was sensitive to the cold, but her true sensitivity was to looking anything less than wealthy. They were swiping that black card with the absolute certainty that they would never have to pay the bill. They thought they had outsmarted me so thoroughly that my money was now just monopoly money to them. Garrett was not going to be left out of the spending spree. By mid-afternoon, an alert popped up from a premium automotive rental agency based in Telluride. Garrett had not just rented a standard four-wheel drive vehicle to get them up the mountain safely. He had secured 2 fully loaded imported luxury sport utility vehicles, complete with premium winter packages and concierge delivery to the airport terminal. The authorization hold alone was astronomical. I could easily imagine Garrett sitting in his home office, feeling incredibly smug as he typed my credit card number into the reservation portal. He probably told himself he deserved it for putting up with my hesitation over the property deed. He probably thought he was a genius for securing the vehicles on my dime while preserving his own dwindling cash reserves. He had no idea that the moment he tried to drive those vehicles off the rental lot, the holding authorizations would violently collide with a closed account. Over the next 10 days, the spending became a spectacle of pure, unadulterated greed. They charged expensive pre-trip spa treatments, claiming they needed to be relaxed before hitting the slopes. They booked reservations at Michelin-starred restaurants in Telluride, requiring massive non-refundable deposits to secure the private dining rooms. They even charged a hefty sum at a high-end wine merchant, having cases of premium vintage bottles shipped directly to the lodge ahead of their arrival. It was a masterclass in entitlement. They were celebrating their victory over me by draining the very accounts they thought they had secured. I sat in my quiet house and monitored every single transaction. I did not send a single text message to question their purchases. I did not make a single phone call to tell them to slow down. I simply let the trap open wider and wider. Occasionally, Trevor would send a message to our family group chat. He would send a photo of a new designer jacket or a screenshot of their first-class itinerary, accompanied by a message thanking me for being so generous and making this a Christmas they would never forget. His words were dripping with the fake sugary sweetness that would have fooled anyone else. I knew it was just the strategy Garrett had outlined in their secret chat. Stroke his ego until he signs. I played my part flawlessly. I replied with short, cheerful messages, telling them they deserved a wonderful break, and that I was looking forward to seeing them enjoy themselves. My lack of resistance only fueled their arrogance. Because I was not fighting them, they assumed I had completely surrendered. They believed the frail, confused old man they saw in my living room was completely incapable of understanding the financial magnitude of what they were doing. They thought my silence was submission. They never stopped to consider that my silence was actually the sound of a predator patiently waiting in the tall grass. As the departure date drew closer, the pending charges on the corporate accounts swelled to an absolutely breathtaking total. It was tens of thousands of dollars in luxury experiences and material goods, all floating in the digital space between authorization and settlement. Mr. Whitlock and I had coordinated the timing perfectly. The credit card companies would allow the initial holds to process, giving my family the illusion of unlimited purchasing power. But the final sweep, the moment the merchants attempted to convert those holds into actual captured funds, would coincide perfectly with the execution orders we had placed. I packed my own bags in the quiet solitude of my bedroom. I did not pack heavy winter coats or snow boots. I packed lightweight linen shirts, comfortable walking shoes, and a single pair of sunglasses. I zipped my modest suitcase closed, then left it by the front door. The house was spotless and empty. I walked through the rooms, turning off the lights one by one. I felt no sorrow as I looked at the walls that had sheltered my family for decades. The people I had loved and protected in this house were gone, replaced by strangers, consumed by greed. I stepped out into the freezing winter air and locked the door behind me. They were currently at the airport, sipping complimentary champagne in the first-class lounge, waiting to board their flight to Telluride. I was getting into a taxi to head to a different terminal. The spending spree was finally over. The bill was about to come due. While Trevor and Danielle were busy stuffing designer snow pants into oversized luggage across town, I was sitting at my dining room table with a single manila envelope. The house was utterly silent. I did not have the television on. I did not have music playing. I simply listened to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. They thought they had secured this house. They thought they had backed me into a corner with their aggressive tax consultant and their fake concern. They had no idea that I had already made a single phone call to a commercial real estate developer 2 days ago. The developer had been trying to buy my double lot for 5 years. He wanted to tear down my classic colonial home and build 2 modern luxury properties in its place. I had always refused because Marianne loved the garden, and I loved the memories. But memories are just ghosts that tie you to a past that no longer exists. I invited the developer over, while the kids were busy buying ski goggles on my corporate card. I told him I wanted a cash offer with a 10-day closing period, and absolutely no contingencies. I told him I would leave the furniture, the appliances, and the memories right where they were. He offered me a price slightly below market value for the speed and convenience, but I did not care about maximizing the profit. I cared about the finality of the transaction. I signed the absolute transfer of deed right there at the dining table. The money was wired directly into the untouchable offshore trust Mr. Whitlock had established. I stood up from the table and walked down the hallway to my bedroom. I pulled a small carry-on suitcase from the top shelf of the closet. I did not pack any of the heavy wool coats or the thick sweaters I usually took on our winter trips. I packed 5 lightweight linen shirts, 3 pairs of khaki trousers, and comfortable walking shoes. I packed a small leather toiletry bag. I packed the framed photograph of Marianne from my nightstand, wrapping it carefully in a soft cotton shirt to keep the glass from breaking. That was it. 40 years of building a life in this house, and everything I truly cared to keep fit into a bag that weighed less than 20 pounds. I did not feel a single ounce of grief. I felt clean. I felt like a man who had been carrying a boulder on his back for a decade and finally decided to set it down. I walked through the house one last time. I looked at the grand dining table where I had endured Thanksgiving just a few weeks ago. I looked at the sofa where Danielle had rolled her eyes at my decorating choices. I left the expensive television on the wall. I left the antique silver in the cabinets. I left the fine china Marianne and I received on our wedding day. The developer would probably send a clean-out crew to throw it all into a dumpster before the demolition started. I found that thought strangely comforting. It was better for those things to be destroyed by a bulldozer than to be picked over and fought over by greedy children who only saw dollar signs. I walked out the front door and locked the deadbolt. I dropped the heavy brass key into a prepaid envelope addressed to the developer and dropped it into the mailbox at the end of the driveway. My car service arrived right on time. A sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out and took my small suitcase, placing it gently in the trunk. I climbed into the back seat and told him to take me to the international airport. I watched my neighborhood roll past the tinted windows, the familiar houses, the frost-covered lawns, the street lamps beginning to glow against the fading winter light. I was leaving the cold behind. I was leaving the manipulation behind. I was leaving the role of the foolish, helpless father completely behind. When I arrived at the airport, I did not go to the terminal for the flights heading to Colorado. My children were probably already in the air, flying first class, sipping complimentary champagne, and toasting to their brilliant manipulation. They thought I was catching a later flight to join them. They thought I was going to walk into that luxury lodge tonight and play the role of the generous patriarch one last time before they sprang their final trap. I walked past the domestic terminals and headed toward the gates departing for the deep south. I handed my boarding pass to the attendant. The destination printed on the paper was a small, quiet island on the Gulf Coast of Florida. I found my seat by the window. The plane engines roared to life, and we began to taxi down the runway. I looked out at the falling snow one last time before we lifted into the clouds. As the airplane climbed higher above the winter storm, I felt a profound sense of isolation, and it was beautiful. For years, my phone had been a source of constant anxiety. It was an anchor tying me to demands for money, complaints about siblings, and endless requests for favors. Now it was just a piece of plastic in my pocket. I thought about Mr. Whitlock sitting in his penthouse office, monitoring the automated financial triggers we had set. Every legal firewall was in place. Every trust was sealed tightly. I was floating 30,000 feet in the air, completely untouchable. I ordered a simple black coffee from the flight attendant. I held the warm paper cup in my hands and watched the landscape shift from frozen white mountains to the deep green and blue of the southern coast. The children would be arriving in Telluride right about now. They would be complaining to the valet, demanding the best suites, ordering expensive room service, because they believed I was footing the bill. They believed their carefully constructed world was completely solid. They did not know the foundation had already been demolished. My phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an automated text message confirming that Trevor and his wife had checked into the Telluride Lodge using the corporate card. The authorization hold had been placed perfectly. The trap was armed and waiting. I turned my phone on silent. I closed my eyes and let the steady hum of the airplane carry me away. The silence of my departure was the loudest statement I had ever made. I had played the game perfectly. I had let them believe they were the smartest people in the room, while I quietly dismantled their entire reality. I leaned my head against the cool window and smiled. The warm air of Florida was waiting for me, and a very cold reality was waiting for them. I was officially a ghost to them until the clock struck 5. I stepped off the plane into the warm, salty air of the Gulf Coast of Florida, right around the time the heavy tires of Garrett and Trevor's rented luxury vehicles crunched into the icy driveway of the Telluride Lodge. I did not have to be there to see it. I knew exactly how they would arrive. They would leave the vehicles parked haphazardly at the valet stand, leaving the doors open and expecting the lodge staff to manage their massive, expensive luggage. They would walk into the grand timber-framed lobby of the resort, wearing their brand-new designer winter coats, acting as if they owned the entire mountain. I settled into the back of a taxi, heading toward my beachfront hotel, while they marched up to the mahogany front desk to demand their keys. The automated alerts on my phone painted a perfect picture of their arrival. A pending charge flashed across my screen for an immediate upgrade to the master suite. Trevor was never satisfied with the standard luxury accommodations. He needed the vaulted ceilings and the stone fireplaces to feel like a true chief executive. I could easily imagine him leaning against the reception desk, tapping his fingers impatiently while the clerk processed the corporate card. The authorization hold went through smoothly. The bank computer systems recognized my massive credit limit and granted them the keys to their temporary castles. The trap was holding steady. They had complete access to the illusion of my wealth. While the bellhops struggled with their heavy bags, Danielle and Kelsey immediately began complaining. They did not keep their voices down. They wanted the staff and the other wealthy guests in the lobby to hear their manufactured plight. I knew they were putting on a performance, complaining loudly about how exhausted they were because they had to manage the travel logistics all by themselves. Danielle probably sighed dramatically and told the concierge that her elderly father had completely missed his flight. She would frame it as a tragic inconvenience. She would say he was getting too confused and too old to manage simple schedules. They were laying the groundwork for the assisted living narrative right there in the hotel lobby, telling complete strangers that I was becoming a massive burden to their otherwise perfect lives. Once they settled into their upgraded suites, the real spending began. The notifications on my phone started arriving in rapid succession. It was mid-afternoon in Colorado, But they were not interested in hitting the ski slopes. They were interested in exploiting the room service menu. A pending charge for $800 appeared. They had ordered the premium seafood tower and vintage champagne to be delivered directly to the room. I could picture Garrett sitting by the roaring fire, popping the cork on a bottle that cost more than most people made in a week. He would pour glasses for everyone, toasting to their brilliance. They were celebrating the fact that they had successfully manipulated a foolish old man into funding their extravagant holiday. They thought they had secured my house and my legacy. They believed the champagne they were drinking was just an early dividend of their future inheritance. An hour later, another alert popped up on my screen. This one was from the luxury spa, located on the lower level of the lodge. Kelsey and Danielle had booked the most expensive signature treatments available. They selected hot stone massages, imported facial scrubs, and private aromatherapy sessions. They charged it all directly to the suite. They walked through the resort, wrapped in plush white robes, treating the staff like personal servants. Kelsey likely complained that the massage stones were not hot enough, or that the herbal tea was too bitter. They needed to find flaws in the luxury to prove that their tastes were incredibly refined. They were playing the role of wealthy socialites, flawlessly, completely unaware that their entire performance was being funded by a ghost. While the women were at the spa, Trevor and Garrett headed to the exclusive members-only lounge, overlooking the snowy peaks. The alerts told me they were ordering top-shelf bourbon. They were probably sitting in deep leather chairs discussing their plans for my house. Trevor might be talking about how he would use the equity from the sale of my property to expand his failing business. Garrett would be nodding along, planning how he would use his portion to pay down his secret debts. They were dividing up my life savings over glasses of $100 bourbon. They felt completely invincible. They looked out at the falling snow and saw a vast empire that they believed they had rightfully conquered. I arrived at my hotel on the Gulf Coast and checked into a modest, comfortable room overlooking the ocean. The air conditioning hummed quietly. I unpacked my few lightweight shirts and placed Marianne's framed photograph on the nightstand. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my phone. The list of pending charges was staggering. In just a few hours, they had racked up thousands of dollars in incidental expenses. They were pushing the corporate card to its absolute limits, absolutely certain that my bank accounts would absorb the impact without a single issue. They felt no guilt. They only felt entitlement. I walked out onto my small balcony and felt the warm tropical sun on my face. The contrast between my quiet reality and their chaotic greed was profound. They were surrounded by snow and luxury, desperately trying to consume as much as possible before I supposedly arrived on a later flight. They were waiting for me to walk through the lodge doors so they could resume their fake smiles and their hollow hugs. They were waiting to stroke my ego just a little bit longer. They had no idea I was thousands of miles away. They had no idea the credit cards they were casually tossing onto silver trays were tied to accounts that were currently in the final stages of a permanent legal shutdown. The sun was slowly beginning to set over the water. The clock was ticking closer to 5. The incidental charges were piling up higher and higher, ensuring that when the floor finally gave way, the drop would be absolutely devastating. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Florida sky in shades of deep orange and violet. I sat on my balcony, listening to the gentle crash of the waves against the shore. I had my phone resting on the glass table next to my coffee cup. The digital clock on the screen read 2 minutes left. 2 minutes, until the invisible safety net I had woven for my children completely unraveled. I closed my eyes and pictured the majestic lobby of the Telluride ski lodge. Right about now, the grandfather clock in that timber-framed lobby was preparing to chime. Trevor and Garrett were likely sitting in the plush leather chairs by the massive stone fireplace, laughing loudly and ordering another round of imported bourbon. Danielle and Kelsey were probably making their way down from the spa, wrapped in the glow of $1,000 facials, completely oblivious to the financial earthquake about to hit them. They were waiting for me to arrive from the airport to play the role of the generous and easily manipulated patriarch. The clock struck 5. In a penthouse office hundreds of miles away, my attorney, Mr. Whitlock, watched his computer screen as the automated execution orders triggered perfectly. With a few lines of digital code, the massive credit limit attached to the black corporate cards was permanently revoked. The accounts were closed, the corporate bridge loans were terminated, and the authorized user privileges were instantly dissolved. The money simply ceased to exist. At that exact same moment, the accounting software at the Telluride Resort ran its daily evening audit. It attempted to capture the final $15,000 payment for the luxury suites, along with the thousands of dollars in incidental charges my family had racked up throughout the afternoon. The lodge computer sent a request to the bank, expecting an immediate approval based on the black card they had swiped at check-in. The response from the bank was instantaneous. Declined. Account closed. Do not honor. I did not have to be in the lobby to know exactly how the scene played out. I had dealt with luxury resort management during my business travel days. When a card attached to a bill of that magnitude declines, the polite subservience of the hotel staff vanishes very quickly. The front desk manager, a professional whose entire job was to separate actual wealth from fake wealth, printed out the denial slip. He walked out from behind the mahogany desk and approached the fireplace where my son was holding court. Trevor probably did not even look up at first. He was so used to treating service workers like invisible background characters in his life. He likely expected the manager to offer him a complimentary dessert or ask if the suite was to his liking. Instead, the manager leaned down and spoke in a quiet, firm voice, letting Trevor know that the credit card on file had been declined. He would have asked for a secondary form of payment to cover the massive outstanding balance. I know my son. I know his pride and his explosive arrogance. Trevor would have laughed out loud, waving his hand dismissively. He would have told the manager that it was obviously a fraud alert. He would have explained in a loud, condescending tone that his father was a very wealthy man flying in later that evening, and that the bank simply flagged the charge because the amount was so incredibly high. He would have told the manager to go back to his little desk and run the card again. The manager, a man who dealt with arrogant tourists every single winter, would not have flinched. He would have walked back to the desk, run the card a second time, and watched the same stark message appear on his monitor. Declined. Account closed. When the manager returned to the fireplace, his tone would have lost any trace of hospitality. He would have informed Trevor that the account was not flagged for fraud, but permanently closed by the primary account holder. He would have handed Trevor the printed receipt showing the denial code. The reality of the situation would have hit my son like a bucket of freezing water. The other wealthy guests in the lobby would have started to turn their heads, drawn by the sudden shift in the atmosphere. Danielle and Kelsey, arriving from the spa, would have walked into the lobby just in time to see Trevor turning pale. Trevor would have stood up from his leather chair, his face flushing with a mixture of profound embarrassment and rising panic. He would have snatched the paper from the manager, staring at the words, trying to make sense of the impossible. He would have pulled out his cell phone to log into his banking application, confident that he could just transfer funds from his business accounts to cover the immediate problem. He would not know yet that the business accounts were completely empty. The manager would not back down. He would explain clearly and loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear that the lodge required an immediate alternative payment. The total bill for the suites, the spa treatments, the room service, and the premium alcohol had already exceeded $20,000. The manager would state that if a valid card was not provided within the hour, the resort would have no choice but to lock the doors to their suites, hold their luggage as collateral, and contact the local authorities to report a theft of services. Garrett would have jumped up, trying to play the peacemaker, trying to use his own artificial charm to diffuse the situation. Garrett always believed he was the smartest man in the room. He would have reached into his designer wallet and pulled out his own platinum credit card, offering it to the manager with a smug smile. He would have told Trevor not to worry, that he would cover the holiday until my banking error was sorted out. Garrett wanted to look like the hero. He wanted to look like the savior of Christmas. The manager would have taken Garrett's platinum card and walked back to the front desk. The four of them would have stood together by the fire, whispering furiously. Danielle would be complaining about the humiliation. Kelsey would be whining about the staff being rude. Trevor would be frantically dialing my phone number, trying to demand answers from the foolish old man he thought he had completely controlled. My phone vibrated on the glass table. I looked down at the screen. It was a call from Trevor. The caller identification flashed brightly in the twilight of the Florida evening. The 5 o'clock panic had officially begun. I picked up the phone, holding it in the palm of my hand, feeling the steady, rhythmic buzzing. I did not answer. I just watched the screen until the call went to voicemail. 10 seconds later, a text message arrived. "Dad, call me immediately. The lodge is declining the card, and they are threatening to kick us out. Fix this right now." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The air felt perfect. The trap had snapped shut with bone-crushing force. The humiliation they were experiencing in that lobby was just the opening act. The true depth of their ruin had not even fully revealed itself to them yet. They thought this was a simple banking error. They thought I was just an incompetent old man who forgot to notify the credit card company about his travel plans. They had absolutely no idea that their entire financial existence had just been systematically erased. I set the phone back down on the table and let it ring. Garrett always had a desperate need to be the smartest and most capable man in any room. I could easily picture him stepping in front of a panicked Trevor in that grand timber-framed lobby. Garrett would smooth the lapels of his designer winter coat and offer a condescending smile to the front desk manager. He would reach into his expensive leather wallet and extract his own heavy metal platinum card, holding it out like a magic wand. He would tell the manager not to worry about the confusion. He would say his elderly father-in-law simply forgot to set a travel alert on the corporate accounts, and that he would happily cover the holiday expenses until the banking error was sorted out. Garrett desperately wanted to play the hero. He wanted to be the savior of Christmas. He wanted Danielle to look at him with admiration, and he wanted Trevor to feel indebted to him. The front desk manager, a man who had already lost his patience for their arrogance, would take the platinum card without a single word. He would slide it through the terminal, while Garrett leaned against the mahogany desk, radiating smug confidence. Garrett would be waiting for the satisfying electronic beep of approval. Instead, the machine would remain silent, and the monitor would flash the same stark red error message, declined. Garrett would lose his arrogant smile instantly. He would blink in confusion and demand that the manager run the card again, claiming his credit limit was virtually endless and that the hotel system must be malfunctioning. The manager would run it a second time, only to hand the card back with a cold, professional stare. The result was exactly the same. The card was dead. Garrett did not know that. At exactly 5 o'clock, his carefully constructed financial reality had finally caught up with him. He did not know that the automated deficit coverage protocol managed by Mr. Whitlock had been permanently terminated. Without my private portfolio quietly liquidating assets to cover the massive shortfall on his luxury estate, the mortgage company had immediately flagged his account for default. The bank algorithm had instantly run a real-time debt-to-income audit. The system saw that his actual consulting income could not even cover the interest payments on his sprawling home. To mitigate their massive risk, the bank had initiated an emergency freeze on all of his revolving credit lines. His platinum card, the symbol of his supposed wealth and status, was now nothing more than a useless piece of heavy metal. While Garrett was arguing furiously with the stone-faced manager, Trevor was standing a few feet away, staring frantically at his glowing cell phone. I knew exactly what my son was doing. He was logging into his business banking portal. In his mind, he was a highly successful chief executive with a thriving tech startup. He intended to simply transfer funds from his corporate accounts to his personal checking to cover the lodge bill and save face. He typed his password into the application with trembling fingers and waited for the financial dashboard to load. I could imagine the last drop of color draining from his face when the numbers finally appeared on his screen. The available balance was absolute zero. For 3 years, my anonymous shell corporation had been depositing thousands of dollars into that specific account every single month. I was the ghost investor, keeping his delusion alive. At 5 o'clock, those deposits vanished into thin air. Without my invisible money artificially inflating his ledger, the automated payments for his useless business consultants, his expensive downtown office space, and his premium software subscriptions had triggered immediately. His creditors had auto-drafted every last cent the moment the funds stopped arriving, leaving the account completely hollow. Trevor stared at the screen, his thumb refreshing the application over and over again. He probably thought the banking server was down, or that he had typed the wrong password. He could not comprehend that his entire identity as a successful entrepreneur had been erased in a matter of seconds. He was swiping at the glass screen, breathing heavily, trying to find the money that had always magically been there to catch him when he fell. Danielle and Kelsey stood together in the center of the lobby, wrapped in their plush spa robes, watching the two men they thought were financial titans completely unravel before their eyes. The pristine illusion of their superiority was crumbling right there on the heated marble floors of the Telluride resort. The front desk manager crossed his arms over his chest and politely informed the group that they had officially run out of payment options. He told them the total balance was outstanding and that the lodge policy was very clear. The clock was ticking. They were standing in one of the most expensive winter destinations in the world, surrounded by wealthy strangers, and they suddenly had absolutely nothing to their names. The sheer panic would be setting in quickly, replacing their entitlement with raw, desperate terror. They had no cash. They had no working credit cards. And the ghost who always paid their way was sitting on a warm beach thousands of miles away, perfectly content to let them freeze. The warm ocean breeze drifted across my balcony on the Gulf Coast of Florida, carrying the faint scent of salt and blooming jasmine. I sat in a comfortable wicker chair, holding a white ceramic mug of black coffee. The sky was turning brilliant shades of orange and pink as the sun began to dip below the horizon. It was a perfect and peaceful evening. On the small glass table next to my chair, my cell phone sat perfectly still. The digital clock on the screen shifted to 5:01 in the afternoon, and then the profound silence finally broke. The phone vibrated against the glass table with a loud, aggressive buzz. The screen lit up, illuminating the twilight. It was a text message from Trevor. The preview read that the corporate card was declining, and he demanded I call the bank right now to fix the embarrassment. I did not move. I just watched the screen. 3 seconds later, another message arrived from him. He typed that the front desk manager was waiting and that I was ruining their entire vacation. The spelling was full of frantic errors, showing his fingers were moving with panicked haste. He was rapidly losing his mind. Then Danielle joined the assault. Her name flashed across the screen, followed by a massive block of angry text. She typed that Garrett just tried to use his own heavy metal platinum card, and it was completely frozen. She demanded to know what I did to their accounts. She typed that they were standing in the middle of a crowded lobby, wearing their white spa robes, and wealthy strangers were staring at them. She said I was an absolute embarrassment and ordered me to pick up the phone this instant. The phone began to ring. Trevor was calling. The bright green accept button flashed over and over again, practically begging me to rescue my son from the spectacular disaster he had created. I did not touch the device. I took a slow sip of my warm coffee and let it ring until it went to voicemail. I wanted a permanent record of their desperation. I wanted to hear exactly what it sounded like when arrogant people realize they are entirely powerless. A minute later, the voicemail icon appeared. I pressed play and lifted the phone to my ear. I did not hear the usual smug voice of a successful tech chief executive. I heard the shaky, breathless voice of a terrified boy. Trevor was begging me to call the front desk and give them a different credit card number. But the most revealing part of the message was not what Trevor said into the receiver. It was the chaotic background noise echoing behind him. I could clearly hear the crisp, professional voice of the lodge manager projecting through the grand timber-framed lobby. The manager was speaking to Garrett, and his tone was absolute ice. I heard the manager state that the total outstanding balance for the suites, the spa treatments, and the room service was over $20,000. He explained that multiple credit cards had returned hard decline codes, indicating closed accounts and severe defaults. I heard Garrett try to argue, claiming his wealth was tied up in complex investments and demanding respect. The manager did not care about Garrett and his fake wealth. Then the manager delivered the ultimate ultimatum. I heard him tell my children that they had exactly 60 minutes to return to their suites, pack their luxury belongings, and vacate the premises immediately. He stated very clearly that if they were not off the resort property within 1 hour, he would call the local authorities and have them formally arrested for defrauding a luxury hotel and committing felony theft of services. I heard Danielle start screaming at Garrett in the background, demanding to know why his platinum card was dead. I heard Kelsey let out a loud, hysterical sob. She cried out, asking how they were supposed to leave when they did not even have money to put premium gas in their massive rented vehicles. She wailed that it was freezing outside, and they had nowhere to go. Trevor brought the phone closer to his mouth, and his voice cracked as he pleaded with me one last time before the automated voicemail system beeped and ended the recording. I lowered the phone and looked out at the gentle ocean waves. For decades, I had rushed to their rescue the moment they experienced even a minor inconvenience. I had paid their debts, smoothed over their mistakes, and subsidized their lavish lifestyles just to keep the peace. I had allowed them to treat me like a disposable resource because I thought my generosity would eventually teach them gratitude. I had been completely wrong. My invisible money had only taught them how to be exceptional parasites. Now they were stranded in the freezing mountains of Colorado. They had absolutely no cash and no active credit lines. The luxury sport utility vehicles they rented required fuel they could not afford to buy. The expensive designer winter coats they purchased earlier that week were sitting in suitcases they were about to drag through the snow in total public humiliation. They were facing the very real threat of spending Christmas Eve sitting in a local jail cell explaining to police officers why they attempted to steal a luxury vacation. The phone buzzed again. The clock now read 5:15. It was a text from Kelsey. She typed that she was crying in the lobby bathroom, hiding from the judgmental stares of the other guests. She begged me to wire money to her personal checking account so they could at least book a cheap motel room down the mountain. She typed that she knew Trevor and Garrett had been rude, but she promised they would all make it up to me if I just saved them tonight. She typed that they were completely terrified. They were finally experiencing the real world, a world where actions have very real and very painful consequences, a world where you cannot plot to steal an elderly man and his home and expect him to continue paying for your imported champagne, a world where the safety net simply does not exist. I sat back in my wicker chair and watched the sky turn a deep, bruised purple. The frantic texts continued to pour in, lighting up the glass table like a strobe light. They were begging the very man they had mocked and plotted against just a few short weeks ago. The power dynamic had shifted completely and permanently. I let them sweat. I let the absolute reality of their destitution sink deeply into their bones before I decided it was time to finally answer the ringing phone. The phone on the glass table shifted from a standard incoming call to a video request. Danielle was requesting a face-to-face connection. The screen displayed her name in bright white letters against the darkening sky. I let it ring 3 times. I took one final deep breath of the warm, salty air. Then I reached out and pressed the green accept button. The video feed connected immediately. The contrast between my environment and theirs was visually jarring. My screen showed Danielle holding her phone with a trembling hand. She was standing outside the main entrance of the lodge. Thick snowflakes were falling around her, catching in her hair. Her nose was bright red from the freezing mountain air. Behind her, Trevor and Garrett were pacing back and forth, furiously on the icy pavement. Kelsey was sitting on a pile of expensive luggage, wrapping her arms around herself to stay warm. Danielle stared at her screen, and her mouth dropped open. She was expecting to see me sitting in my suburban living room, looking confused and apologetic. Instead, she saw a clear blue ocean and a vibrant orange sunset behind me. She saw me wearing a lightweight linen shirt, completely relaxed. "Dad, where are you?" she demanded, her voice shrill and echoing with panic. "What is going on? We are standing in the freezing snow, and the lodge manager just called the local police. Give us a working credit card number right now." Trevor shoved his face into the frame, pushing Danielle aside. "Dad, stop playing games," he yelled. "My business accounts are completely frozen. Garrett said his card is declining everywhere. You need to call Mr. Whitlock and tell him the bank made a massive mistake before we end up in a jail cell." I looked at their desperate, angry faces. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the heartbreak they had caused me over the past decade. I kept my expression entirely neutral and my tone incredibly calm. "There is no mistake, Trevor," I said smoothly. "The bank executed my exact instructions. Mr. Whitlock processed the final paperwork yesterday afternoon. Every corporate account is permanently closed. Danielle grabbed the phone back, her eyes wide with shock. "What are you talking about?" she screamed. "You gave us the black cards. You told us to book the best vacation ever. You said you wanted Christmas to be perfect." I leaned back in my wicker chair and took a sip of my coffee. "I wanted my Christmas to be perfect," I replied. "And it is absolutely beautiful, down here in Florida. But I never said I was going to pay for your Christmas. You see, I accidentally picked up your coat after Thanksgiving dinner. Trevor, I saw your screen. I read every single message in your group chat." The silence that fell over the freezing mountain was absolute. Even through the poor audio quality of the video call, I could hear the wind howling around them. Trevor turned perfectly white. The aggressive, arrogant posture he always carried completely evaporated. Danielle stopped breathing. Garrett, who had been pacing in the background, suddenly stood completely still, staring at the phone screen. "Operation Deed," I said, letting the two words hang in the air like a judge delivering a final verdict. "You wanted to stroke my ego just long enough to get a free ski trip. You wanted to trick me into signing over the house to save on taxes. You planned to shove me into an assisted living facility the second we got home, so you would not have to deal with my penny pinching anymore." "Dad," Trevor stammered, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Dad, that was just a joke. We were just venting because we were stressed. You cannot take that seriously." I did not smile. I did not offer them any comfort. "I took it very seriously," I told him. "So seriously that I decided to give you exactly what you wanted. I sold the house 3 days ago to a commercial developer. The cash is locked in an offshore trust you will never be able to touch. You do not have to worry about my living arrangements anymore, because I am never coming back to that city." Danielle began to cry, real tears of profound terror. "Dad, please," she begged. "The bank says our mortgage is in default. They froze Garrett's accounts. We are going to lose the house. We have no money." "You never had any money, Danielle," I explained patiently. "The only reason your massive mortgage was ever approved was because I was quietly subsidizing it every single month. Your husband is not a successful financial consultant. He is drowning in debt. And Trevor, you are not a visionary tech founder. Your company generates absolutely zero profit. The anonymous angel investor, keeping your doors open, was me. I was the one funding your Turks and Caicos trips and your expensive dinners. I watched the realization crush them. The illusion of their superiority shattered completely on that icy sidewalk. They finally understood that they were not brilliant, successful adults. They were completely dependent parasites, and the host had just cut them off." Kelsey lunged toward the phone, her face stained with ruined makeup. "Warren, you cannot leave us here," she wailed. "We cannot even buy gas to get to the airport. We are going to freeze to death." "You are adults," I said calmly. "You are wearing thousands of dollars worth of designer winter clothing that you charged to my account just a few days ago. I suggest you sell those jackets to a pawn shop to buy your bus tickets home." Danielle lost whatever control she had left. She screamed into the camera, her face twisted with a mixture of rage and absolute despair. "You are ruining our lives," she shrieked. "You are a terrible father. You planned this whole thing just to destroy us? How could you do this to your own family?" I looked at my daughter. I looked at the son I had raised. I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. The endless well of parental forgiveness had run completely dry. "I did not destroy your lives," I replied, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper that cut through their hysteria. "I just stopped artificially funding your delusions." You wanted me out of the way so you could control the money. Well, I am out of the way, and the money is gone. I stopped paying for the privilege of being your burden. You own your lives now. Good luck. I did not wait for Danielle to scream again. I did not wait for Trevor to offer another pathetic excuse. I reached forward and tapped the red button on the screen, ending the call instantly. The video feed vanished, replacing their freezing, panicked faces with the serene reflection of my own calm expression. I held the power button down until the phone powered off completely and the screen went totally black. I set the useless device back down on the glass table. The sun had finally set, leaving the Florida sky painted in soft, beautiful twilight. I sat alone on my balcony, listening to the rhythmic, soothing sound of the ocean waves. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried for a decade was entirely gone. I was no longer a silent wallet. I was no longer a punching bag for entitled children. I was simply a man, enjoying a warm, peaceful evening, completely free. I pressed the power button, and the screen went black, leaving them completely alone in the freezing Colorado night. I did not need to be standing on that icy pavement to know exactly how the next hour unfolded. The details would come to me later, through a series of increasingly pathetic voicemails and digital receipts. The moment the video feed cut out, the absolute reality of their situation collapsed on top of them with the weight of an avalanche. There was no more safety net. There was no more wealthy father to manipulate. Trevor stared at his dead phone screen while the bitter wind whipped through the grand entrance of the lodge, cutting right through the designer jacket he had bought with my money. The front desk manager did not give them a moment to grieve their lost inheritance. He stepped out through the heavy glass doors, accompanied by two broad-shouldered private security guards. The manager informed them that their 60 minutes were officially up. Since no valid payment had been provided, the lodge was trespassing them from the property. Garrett tried to puff out his chest and argue, demanding access to their master suites to retrieve their belongings. He tried to project the authority of a wealthy financial consultant, but his voice shook in the freezing air. The security guards simply stepped forward, crossing their arms. The manager explained that the resort staff had already packed their luxury luggage and brought it down to the service entrance. They were not allowed back inside the warm lobby. They were treated exactly like the common thieves they had become. Danielle and Kelsey were forced to walk around the perimeter of the majestic timber-framed building, shivering in the knee-deep snow. Wealthy guests sipping hot cocoa by the massive windows watched the spectacle with quiet amusement. The women who just hours ago had been parading through the spa wrapped in plush robes, treating the staff like peasants, were now being escorted off the premises like vagrants. They dragged their heavy, overpriced suitcases across the salted asphalt, their designer boots slipping on the ice. The absolute humiliation was a poison they had to swallow in front of the very social class they had so desperately tried to impress. They finally reached the parking lot, where their rented imported sport utility vehicles were parked. Garrett unlocked his massive vehicle, expecting the heated leather seats to offer some sanctuary from the biting cold. But as he turned the ignition, the dashboard illuminated with a glaring yellow warning light. The fuel tank was nearly empty. They had driven the vehicles hard up the mountain, wasting premium gas, with the absolute certainty that they could just swipe my corporate card at the local station. Trevor checked his rental and found the exact same problem. They had two luxury tanks and absolutely zero means to fuel them. The temperature was dropping rapidly, plunging well below zero. Sitting in the idling cars, watching the fuel gauge tick closer to empty, desperation finally broke their pride. They pulled out their phones and began the humiliating process of begging. Garrett called the wealthy clients he always bragged about, asking for an emergency wire transfer, claiming his bank had made a massive security error. One by one, his calls went to voicemail, or were met with polite but firm refusals. No one believed the banking error excuse from a man who claimed to be a financial genius. Trevor scrolled through his contacts, looking for the venture capitalists he had tried to impress with my ghost money. He sent frantic messages, asking for a quick bridge loan just to get his family down the mountain. The responses he received were cold and brief. No one wanted to throw cash at a tech founder who could not even afford a tank of gas on Christmas Eve. Danielle and Kelsey were forced to swallow whatever dignity they had left. Danielle called her friends back in our suburban neighborhood, the same women she usually looked down upon for not having imported countertops or organic catered meals. She sobbed into the receiver, begging them to send $50 to her digital wallet just so they could buy enough fuel to keep the heater running. Kelsey texted distant cousins she had not spoken to in years, pleading for any spare cash to buy a cheap motel room. The powerful, independent women who had planned to throw me into an assisted living facility were now digitally panhandling from the front seat of a freezing car. Eventually, after hours of degrading pleas, they managed to scrape together just enough digital transfers from pitying acquaintances to buy a few gallons of gas. It was not enough to afford a hotel room. It was not enough to buy a warm dinner. It was barely enough to keep the engines turning over so they could begin the miserable, punishing drive down the mountain. There would be no private chefs. There would be no vintage champagne by the fire. There would only be the suffocating silence of 4 broken adults crammed into rented cars they could no longer afford. Driving through the dark winter night, they drove away from the glittering lights of Telluride, leaving behind the grand illusion of their superiority. The snowy roads were treacherous, and the journey back to reality was going to be painfully long. They had spent months calculating my demise, treating my life as nothing more than a stepping stone for their own greed. They had laughed in their secret group chats, plotting to steal the very roof over my head. Now they had absolutely nothing to their names. I sat on my balcony, watching the stars emerge over the quiet Florida ocean, perfectly content. The freezing eviction was exactly what they deserved. It was the brutal awakening they needed to realize that the world does not reward arrogance, and that biting the hand that feeds you will ultimately leave you starving in the cold. The bitter cold of January settled over the city like a heavy blanket. The festive lights of the holiday season burned out, leaving nothing but gray skies and empty bank accounts. For my children, the new year did not bring resolutions or fresh starts. It brought the absolute crushing weight of reality. The illusion they had lived in for a decade was officially dead. The phantom money that had always magically appeared to fix their mistakes was gone forever. They had driven back from the mountains in complete silence, dragging their useless designer luggage into homes they could no longer afford to keep. They spent the first few days of the month waiting for me to call them back. They thought my anger would cool off. They thought I would eventually feel guilty and deposit funds into their accounts to smooth things over. But my silence remained absolute. I sat on my balcony in Florida and let the natural consequences of their actions wash over them. The first domino to fall was Danielle and Garrett. Without my private portfolio quietly transferring $4,000 every 30 days, their massive luxury mortgage officially went into severe default. The bank was completely ruthless. Garrett tried to march into the local branch, wearing his best tailored suit, to demand an extension. He tried to use his artificial charm to negotiate a delay. But the bank algorithms did not care about his imported shoes or his arrogant smile. They only cared about the mathematical reality that he was entirely broke. Within 2 weeks, the formal foreclosure proceedings began. The heavy legal notices arrived in the mail, printed on bright yellow paper, demanding immediate payment in full. Garrett could no longer hide behind his fake identity as a successful financial consultant. His credit score plummeted to the bottom of the charts. His revolving credit lines were permanently shut down. Danielle could no longer host her lavish dinner parties for the neighborhood elite. The rumor mill in their gated community started churning immediately when the lawn care service stopped showing up because their checks bounced. The pristine image my daughter had constructed completely evaporated. She was no longer the queen of the cul-de-sac. She was just a desperate woman sitting in a dark, cold house because she could not afford to pay the heating bill. She had to watch from her window as recovery agents arrived to tow away Garrett's luxury sport utility vehicle. The neighbors she used to gossip with now whispered about her as she walked down the street. The profound social humiliation was a poison she had to swallow every single day. While Danielle and Garrett were watching their domestic kingdom collapse, Trevor was facing a total professional execution. His tech startup had always been a hollow shell, propped up entirely by my anonymous bridge loans. Without my $5,000 monthly deposits, his business checking account remained at absolute zero. The first week of January brought the payroll deadline. His few remaining consultants expected their checks to clear, but the funds simply did not exist. The automated banking system rejected every single transaction. His employees quit immediately, taking their laptops and office supplies as collateral for their unpaid wages. But the true disaster struck when the state tax board flagged his company for a comprehensive audit due to the sudden cascade of bounced payments. Trevor was summoned to provide extensive financial records to prove his business was viable. He had absolutely nothing to show them. There were no real clients and no actual revenue. The state auditors quickly realized his startup was a total sham. Trevor could no longer strut around the downtown district pretending to be a visionary chief executive. He was forced to abandon his expensive leased office space in the middle of the night to avoid the angry property manager. Kelsey realized that her husband was not a genius entrepreneur, but a fraud who had been secretly funded by his elderly father. The luxurious weekends and the expensive dinners were completely over. She was forced to face the real reality that she was married to a man with no income and no future prospects. The pressure broke whatever fragile bond they had left. The group chat they had used to plot my demise turned into a digital war zone. They blamed each other for pushing me too hard. Garrett blamed Trevor for bringing the shady tax lawyer to my house. Danielle blamed Kelsey for complaining about the wine at Thanksgiving. The unified front they had built to steal my estate dissolved into bitter, toxic accusations. They turned on each other with the exact same cruelty they had intended to use on me. Their profound arrogance was entirely stripped away. They had spent their entire adult lives looking down on working-class people, looking down on me for clippy coupons and driving an old truck. They had convinced themselves that they were a superior breed of society, naturally destined for wealth and luxury. But January forced them to look in the mirror and see the ugly truth. They were completely helpless. They had no survival skills and no work ethic. They were sinking fast in an ocean of debt and legal trouble, and there was no life raft coming to save them. The brutal transition from wealthy socialites to struggling debtors broke their spirits completely. They learned that the world is a very cold place when you have to pay your own way. I monitored the fallout from afar, feeling a profound sense of closure. The poison of entitlement had been fully drained from my life. The lesson was incredibly harsh, but it was the only way they would ever understand the true value of everything I had given them. The banks had completely locked their doors to my children, so they decided it was time to kick down mine. By the third week of January, their desperation had mutated into a toxic, frantic anger. They had exhausted every possible avenue for loans and favors. The reality of their total financial ruin was too heavy for them to carry on their own, so they naturally sought out the one person who had always carried their burdens for them. They convinced themselves that the distance and the phone calls were the only reason I had managed to cut them off. They truly believed that if they just showed up at my front door and cornered me in my own living room, the frail old man they manipulated at Thanksgiving would instantly return. They thought physical intimidation was their ultimate trump card. I did not have to be standing on the sidewalk to know how their miserable journey unfolded. Garrett was forced to drive them all in a tiny economy rental car because his imported luxury vehicle had already been dragged away by a recovery agent. The heater in the cheap car likely barely worked against the bitter winter chill. The four of them were crammed into the small space, shivering and furious. Their designer winter coats looked absolutely ridiculous, pressed against the cheap plastic interior of a budget vehicle. Danielle probably rehearsed a speech the entire ride, preparing to scream about how I had emotionally traumatized them. Trevor was undoubtedly clenching his jaw, planning to demand that I call Mr. Whitlock and release his business funds immediately. They fueled each other with false confidence, entirely certain that they could bully me into submission the moment they stepped onto my property. They turned the corner into my quiet suburban neighborhood. The bare oak trees and the frost-covered lawns looked exactly the same as they had for 30 years. They expected to see my old pickup truck parked in the driveway. They expected to march up the front steps, burst through the heavy wooden door, and find me sitting in my leather armchair, waiting to be scolded. But as the small rental car approached my corner lot, the entire picture was completely and fundamentally wrong. A massive wooden post was driven deep into the frozen grass of the front yard. Across the top of this white-painted wood was a bright red banner displaying a single, devastating word: sold. The driveway was not empty, but it did not hold my familiar truck. A massive commercial moving van was parked on the concrete, with its heavy metal ramp resting on the walkway. The front door of the house was propped wide open to the freezing winter air. The heavy antique curtains that Danielle always complained about were completely gone, leaving the large living room windows entirely bare. Trevor and Garrett leaped out of the small car, refusing to believe their own eyes. They marched up the icy walkway, their boots slipping on the frost, determined to find me hiding inside. They walked right through the open front door, fully expecting to see the remnants of their childhood. Instead, they walked into an echoing empty cavern. My leather armchair was gone. The grand dining table, where they had openly mocked my wine selection, was gone. The house had been stripped down to the bare wooden floorboards. In the center of the living room stood a young couple holding clipboards, directing a crew of moving men who were carrying brand new modern furniture into the space. The young man looked at my sons with complete confusion, asking them who they were and why they were standing uninvited in his new home. Trevor felt his voice crack with panic as he demanded to know where his father was. He yelled that this was his family estate and that there had been a massive mistake. The new owner simply shook his head. He explained calmly that there was no mistake at all. He and his wife had purchased the property in a rapid cash transaction from a commercial developer weeks ago. He stated that the previous owner had signed the deed, cleared out the house, and completely vanished. There was no forwarding address left behind. There was no contact information provided. The transaction was absolute and permanently closed. Danielle and Kelsey stumbled through the front door just in time to hear the young man deliver the crushing news. Danielle stared at the empty walls where our family photographs used to hang. The museum she had despised so much had been completely erased. The young owner, feeling understandably threatened by 4 frantic strangers invading his property, politely, but firmly, asked them to leave his house before he called the local police. For the second time in a single month, my children were being formally trespassed and threatened with law enforcement. They had no choice but to back away. They stumbled backward out the front door and slowly descended the porch steps. They stood on the frozen public sidewalk, staring up at the 2-story colonial home they had so confidently planned to steal. The physical reality of their massive failure finally sank deeply into their bones. They realized in that freezing moment that they could not badger me into submission. They could not show up on a Sunday afternoon to eat my catered food and demand my money. They could not drop off assisted living brochures on my kitchen counter. The geographical anchor of their entitlement had been wiped entirely off the map. I had not just cut off their money. I had completely erased myself from their physical world. They were standing in the biting cold, staring at a piece of property that now belonged to complete strangers, realizing that I was no longer a person they could ever reach. I was a ghost. Their safety net was not just broken, it had been incinerated. They climbed back into their freezing economy car, shivering and defeated, with absolutely nowhere left to go. In early February, my attorney, Mr. Whitlock, summoned my children to his penthouse office. They did not arrive in luxury sport utility vehicles. They took a city bus from the suburbs because they could no longer afford to rent a car or buy premium fuel. They walked into that sleek mahogany boardroom, looking absolutely exhausted and completely desperate. Their arrogant posture had been entirely stripped away by weeks of unrelenting financial panic and the looming threat of foreclosure. They sat in the heavy leather chairs, hoping for a negotiation. They likely believed I had finally cooled down and was ready to establish a new allowance for them. They thought Mr. Whitlock was going to hand them a strict contract, but ultimately provide a fresh infusion of cash to save them from ruin. They waited for a lifeline that was never going to come. Mr. Whitlock did not offer them coffee or polite pleasantries. He sat at the head of the long conference table and slid a thick black folder toward Trevor and Danielle. He instructed them to open it. Inside the folder was a meticulously detailed financial ledger. Every single bridge loan I had pumped into Trevor's failing business was listed line by line. Every secret mortgage subsidy I had paid to keep a roof over Danielle and Garrett's heads was perfectly documented alongside the massive incidental charges from their Telluride trip. The grand total printed in bold black ink at the bottom of the final page was $140,000. Garrett stared at the numbers as all his claims of being a self-made financial genius evaporated into thin air. Kelsey began to cry silent tears as she realized the sheer volume of money they had squandered. Mr. Whitlock spoke in a cold, professional tone. He informed them that this document was not an inheritance advance, but a final accounting of the charity they had so deeply abused. Before Trevor could even formulate a pathetic excuse, Mr. Whitlock slid a second document across the smooth table. It was a bound stack of paper, containing high-resolution screenshots of their private text messages. The very top of the page clearly displayed the name of their group chat, Operation Deed. He allowed the absolute silence of the room to suffocate them as they read their own cruel words. They stared at the printed messages where they had plotted to stroke my ego, trick me into signing away my home, and lock me inside an assisted living facility. The color completely drained from Trevor's face. Danielle covered her mouth with her trembling hands, realizing she was caught looking like an absolute monster. Mr. Whitlock looked at my children and told them that I had seen every single word on Thanksgiving night. He let them realize that the entire luxury vacation had been a beautifully orchestrated trap, and they had walked right into it, with their eyes wide open, fueled entirely by their own greed. Trevor tried to speak, trying to salvage whatever tiny scrap of dignity he had left. He asked in a broken voice what was going to happen to the rest of the estate now that my house was sold. Mr. Whitlock delivered the final devastating blow. He informed them that my multi-million-dollar portfolio had been permanently and legally secured. Every remaining asset I owned had been placed into an irrevocable charitable trust, benefiting organizations that actually deserved the funding. He made it perfectly clear to them what the word irrevocable meant. There were no legal loopholes. There would be no future payouts. They were entirely written out of my will forever. They would not receive another dime while I was alive, and they would receive absolutely nothing when I passed away. The meeting was officially over. Mr. Whitlock stood up and directed them to the elevator, leaving them completely and utterly cut off from my world. When Mr. Whitlock called to tell me the meeting had concluded, I was walking barefoot along the warm white sands of the Florida coast. The morning sun was bright against my skin, and the gentle rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves drowned out the noisy memories of my past. I watched a small white sailboat drift across the endless blue horizon and felt an overwhelming, profound sense of freedom. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was not carrying the crushing weight of their massive expectations. I was no longer a human bank account or a stepping stone for their toxic entitlement. I had built my wealth with my own two hands, working tirelessly for decades, and now I was finally going to enjoy the absolute peace it afforded me. I breathed in the fresh, salty air, realizing that true power was never in the money I gave them. It was in my ability to simply walk away. If there is one profound lesson this entire ordeal has taught me, it is that blind generosity can quickly become the architect of your own destruction. When we constantly shield the people we love from the harsh consequences of their actions, we do not teach them gratitude or responsibility. We only teach them how to become entitled and dependent. Real love sometimes requires us to close our wallets and let them fall hard so they can finally learn how to stand on their own 2 feet. You cannot buy respect from people who only value your bank account, and you can never satisfy a greed that has no absolute bottom. If my story resonated with you today, please leave a comment down below sharing your own experiences, and hit that subscribe button to join our community.